A man spent his life trying to prove that integrity was paramount, a fixed point in a fracturing world. He lived by the quiet principle that actions always speak louder than assumptions. But some acts of selfless honesty are doomed before they begin. They are judged not on their outcome, but on the messenger. When a moment of genuine decency collides with an immutable, historical bias, the result is a sudden, searing silence. It's the realization that you can give back everything, yet still be asked why you were tempted to steal. This is the story of an honest man learning that the truth of his character is always secondary to the persistent lie of his appearance. The asphalt shimmered under the unforgiving heat of the summer 2024 sun. I remember the air was thick, heavy with the scent of cheap coffee and frying grease drifting from the Maple Leaf Diner. I was walking, trying to lose myself in the quiet rhythm of Elm Street pavement, when I saw it, a dark, substantial form lying innocently near the curb. It was a heavily filled leather wallet. My heart gave a strange, immediate lurch, not of greed, but of recognition. This was someone's anchor, someone's identity compressed into worn leather. When I picked it up, the weight was staggering. I could feel the dense, uncompromising solidity of cash tucked between plastic cards and frayed receipts. It was enough money to solve some immediate, pressing anxieties I carried. The kind of money that whispers dangerous, seductive solutions into the ears of men just scraping by. I am Marcus Avery, 35 years old. My height and athletic build often precede me, casting a shadow that, in some settings, feels inherently suspicious. But I've always lived by a private, non-negotiable code. Integrity is not a performance. It is the fundamental structure of who I am. It is the quiet shield, the deep-set conviction reflected in my expressive eyes that allows me to navigate the world without succumbing to its chaos. The temptation, if you could call it that, was instantaneous and fleeting, a mosquito buzzing briefly against a pane of glass. I knew, with the kind of clarity that requires no deliberation, that this wallet was not mine to keep, not even for a minute. The sheer inconvenience of finding a treasure that didn't belong to me settled over me like the oppressive summer heat. My internal narrative was simple: find the nearest authority. I bypassed the diner. The owner, a man named Pete, had a habit of treating me with an overly cautious politeness that felt worse than outright. Dismissal and headed straight for the Creekwood County Police substation, just 3 blocks away. The substation was small, brightly lit, and utterly sterile. The cool air inside felt like a shock after the sun-drenched pavement. There was a low hum of fluorescent lights and the scent of industrial cleaner. I approached the counter, placing the heavily filled leather wallet carefully on the smooth, polished surface. A man rose from behind a desk, broad-shouldered and professional. This was Officer Richard Jensen, 42, his brown hair neatly trimmed. He wore the uniform with an air of procedural competence. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, his tone neutral. "I found this," I stated, nodding toward the wallet. "Outside the Maple Leaf Diner, on Elm Street. It's pretty full." Officer Jensen slid the wallet toward himself, his expression still neutral, and picked up a form. The routine was already in motion. "Thank you, mister." He paused, waiting for my name. "Avery. Marcus Avery." He meticulously logged the item onto the police property log, noting the time and location of the discovery. He asked me to confirm the contents visually, listing out the stack of bills, the driver's license, and credit cards, all untouched, pristine. My verification felt redundant yet necessary, a physical affirmation of my intent. "That's a substantial amount of cash, Mr. Avery," Officer Jensen remarked, not accusingly, but stating a fact. "A lot of people wouldn't have brought this in." I shrugged slightly. "It belongs to somebody. They're probably frantic." I waited. I didn't have to. I could have signed the log and left, disappearing back into the anonymity of the summer afternoon. But part of me, the perhaps naive part that still seeks validation for basic decency, wanted to see the transaction through. I wanted the owner to know, unequivocally, that a good man, a decent man, found their lost security. Less than 10 minutes later, the exterior door burst open with an energy that shattered the substation's calm. A man stumbled in, visibly distraught, running a hand through his thinning sandy hair. He was medium height, slightly portly, and radiating pure, unadulterated anxiety. This was Stanley Douglas, 53. He immediately zeroed in on the counter where Officer Jensen was standing. "My wallet! Did anyone turn in a wallet? I must have dropped it near the diner. I've been retracing my steps. I think I left my whole life in that thing." His voice was high-pitched, bordering on frantic. Officer Jensen, calm and reassuring, held up the recovered item. "Is this yours, sir?" Stanley Douglas snatched the heavily filled leather wallet, gripping it like a lifeline. His relief was seismic. A full-body slump followed by a gasp of pure gratitude. He started to open it, his hands shaking, ready to verify the contents. Then his eyes lifted. They lifted from the comforting sight of his own driver's license, past Officer Jensen, and landed squarely on me. I was standing near the door, waiting, just observing. The transition in Stanley Douglas's face was the most chilling thing I have ever witnessed. It was a rapid, visible erosion of humanity. The joy of recovery vanished, replaced by a sharp, cutting suspicion so instantaneous it felt less like a thought and more like an involuntary reflex. It was as if a switch had been flipped, rewriting the entire context of the situation. His gaze swept over my tall, dark frame, lingered on my hands, and returned to my face, the face of the man who had saved him from financial catastrophe. He didn't look at me with gratitude. He looked at me like a witness to a potential crime, even though the evidence of my honesty was literally in his hand. Officer Jensen, oblivious, tried to smooth the waters. "Yes, Mr. Douglas. This is Mr. Hayes, the one who found it and brought it directly here, intact." Jensen's validation meant nothing. It was air, thin and useless, against the dense wall of Douglas's presupposition. Stanley Douglas clutched the wallet tighter, finally looking away from me just long enough to confirm the contents were still there, not out of necessity, but out of a deep-seated need to confirm my failure to steal. He counted the bills with quick, nervous fingers, then shoved them back in. He spoke, but not to the officer. His voice was no longer frantic. It was hardened, sharp, and accusatory, directed solely at me. "Did you look through it first? Were you tempted to take anything first?" The question hit me with the physical force of a punch to the gut. The air truly left the room then. It was a violation. Not of my privacy, but of my essential decency. My heart began to pound, a deep, slow rhythm of outrage and profound weariness. I felt my jaw tighten. I had walked blocks in the oppressive heat, endured the bureaucracy, and waited. All for a moment of quiet moral satisfaction. And this was the payment. I forced myself to remain still, keeping my posture relaxed, fighting the urge to lean in and demand why he hadn't simply thanked me. "Mr. Douglas," Officer Jensen interjected, noticing the shift in atmosphere. His tone was now slightly chastising. "The wallet was logged the moment Mr. Avery brought it in. Every item was accounted for." Stanley Douglas didn't meet Jensen's eye. He kept his gaze locked on mine, assessing, calculating, still not quite believing the officer's testimony. The silence stretched, heavy and poised. He seemed to be mentally running the statistics, weighing the fact of the retrieved wallet against the statistical improbability that a man who looked like me would perform such an act of selfless honesty. "Right. Well, thank you," Douglas muttered, finally shifting his attention back to Jensen. But the thank you felt performative, directed at the badge, not at the person who had actually helped him. He fumbled in the now verified wallet and pulled out a $20 bill. "Here," he said, extending the bill toward me with a look of obligation, not generosity, "for your trouble." It was the ultimate insult. A paltry payment for my good behavior. A transaction to ease his own conscience about the initial searing suspicion he had cast upon me. The money was meant to neutralize the situation, to balance the scales that he himself had tipped with his prejudice. I didn't move. My hands remained at my sides. "Keep it, Mr. Douglas," I said, my voice low, steady, and devoid of the politeness I had maintained throughout the interaction. "My integrity isn't for sale, and it certainly isn't worth $20. Douglas hesitated, the $20 bill suspended in the air between us. He looked bewildered, as if my refusal of the tip was further evidence of some underlying deception. Why would a man like me refuse money? Surely I must have gotten something out of this. Officer Jensen stepped forward, placing a hand on Douglas's shoulder, urging him toward the door. "We're finished here, sir. Have a good day." I turned, not waiting for Douglas to exit or to offer another inadequate apology. The fluorescent light suddenly felt searingly hot, and the sterile air suffocating. I pushed the door open and walked back out into the blistering heat of Elm Street. The moment the door closed behind me, the physical weight of what had just transpired settled onto my shoulders. It was far heavier than the wallet had ever been. My walk back was silent, but my mind was a raging torrent. That question. It wasn't about the cash, it was about me. The material fact of my honesty. The retrieved cash, the verified property log. The officer's word was utterly eclipsed by the immaterial reality of my appearance. My act of selfless integrity was, in that single glance, immediately overwritten as a potential narrative of crime. He looked at me and saw not Marcus Avery, a decent, principled human being, but a caricature of suspicion. He didn't see the man who values his word more than any sum of money. He saw the possibility of theft, simply because of the color of my skin. I remember thinking, the officer validated me, but his validation meant nothing because Douglas had already cast his vote. The officer was upholding the law. Douglas was upholding an internal, societal law written centuries ago. This was the quiet form of prejudice. It didn't need to shout racial epithets. It merely needed to whisper the persistent lie that, no matter what good I achieve, I will never be enough to erase the predetermined suspicion rooted in my identity. I replayed the scene endlessly. The moment his relief transformed into revulsion. The way his eyes darted from the wallet, full of evidence of my innocence, to my face, full of evidence of his perceived guilt. I realized then that my life often felt like an ongoing, unwinnable court case. Every interaction, every moment, was a chance to prove the negative. I am not a threat. I am not a thief. I am not what you assume. And even when the evidence is overwhelming, a recovered wallet, pristine and complete, the verdict is already decided. I had committed an act of profound good, an act that should have resonated with simple human connectivity and gratitude. Instead, it became a mirror reflecting the fundamental, exhausting reality of my existence in this town, in this country. My effort, my choices, my fundamental decency, they are always secondary. The immediate, silent judgment cast upon me precedes my name, my actions, and my intentions. I thought about the thousands of small, unseen decisions I make every day. Pulling my hoodie down before entering a store, standing further away from women waiting for the bus, consciously smiling at strangers to appear less intimidating. These weren't actions of a free man. They were strategic maneuvers of a man perpetually under surveillance, fighting a reputation he never earned. And the wallet incident was the sharpest proof I had ever received that my self-worth is constantly under external siege. I try to do the right thing, the absolute best thing, to be the most honorable version of myself. And still, the first instinct of the man I helped was to question if I had already failed the moral test. The premiser, the bitter, stinging truth that had been whispered to me in the cold light of that police station, was that, while I may commit acts of good, my identity will always speak louder. Stanley Douglas hadn't seen a neighbor. He had seen a stereotype, and the stereotype in his mind demanded an accounting. I walked until the sun began to dip, the overwhelming heat finally easing into a warm, sticky dusk. I didn't feel righteous. I felt hollowed out, drained of the simple satisfaction that should have accompanied my good deed. The injustice wasn't just the question. It was the realization that I had wasted my integrity on someone who could not see it. He was incapable of processing the evidence of my character because it contradicted the deep-seated narrative he held about who I was supposed to be. The experience served as a final, crushing lesson. Sometimes the racism doesn't scream. It doesn't parade with burning crosses or march with angry signs. It merely settles in the air, a persistent, quiet whisper that echoes through the hallways of opportunity and interaction. You will never be enough. I had walked into that police station believing I was proving my character. I walked out understanding that my character, meticulously built and fiercely guarded, was irrelevant. All that mattered, all that truly spoke in that crucial moment of confrontation was the color of my skin. And for some, that voice will always drown out everything else I try to say or do. It's an exhausting way to live, knowing that the foundation of your existence is constantly questioned and that even salvation can be mistaken for thievery. I learned that day that the highest act of decency can still leave you feeling utterly, definitively indicted. And that, I realized, was the true cost of the heavily filled leather wallet. I was free of the money, but burdened by the knowledge. I did the good, but my color spoke louder. And in the quiet solitude of the summer evening, I knew that was a truth I could never return. The heavy door of the substation hissed shut behind me, sealing me out, leaving me alone with the residue of Stanley's contempt. The heat of Elm Street felt less like weather and more like an oppressive atmosphere tailored specifically to press down on me. I didn't just walk. I strode, trying to shed the skin of the encounter. But the question, did you look through it first? Were you tempted to take anything first? Had fused itself to my marrow. It was more than an insult. It was a profound act of erasure. Stanley had not simply been rude. He had taken my entire foundation of self-respect and attempted to disintegrate it, replacing it with his default assumption. What stung most was the clinical, undeniable fact that his suspicion had superseded evidence. His relief lasted maybe 2 seconds before the sight of me triggered the programming. The heavily filled leather wallet, the proof of my integrity, had become merely a prop in his self-confirming drama. I stopped under the inadequate shade of a struggling oak tree near the street corner. My hands felt strange, empty, yet sticky with an invisible residue of degradation. I stared down at my knuckles, trying to regain the simple physical reality of myself. I realized that my immediate reaction in the station had been suppression to hold the line, to keep my voice steady, to refuse the meager $20 not out of pride, but out of a desperate need to maintain my composure and deny him the satisfaction of seeing my pain. But now, outside, the composure dissolved, replaced by a deep, shuddering internal rage that was simultaneously exhausting and terrifying. It was terrifying because it wasn't focused on Stanley. It was focused on the system that created Stanley. I wanted to scream at the silent agreement in the air. The unwritten contract that stipulates certain bodies are inherently less trustworthy than others. I thought about Richard, the officer. He had been polite, professional, and had technically verified my story. Yet even Richard had been a participant in the failure. He hadn't intervened with enough conviction to challenge Stanley's toxic assumption. He had managed the situation, not defended my honor. He had treated Stanley's prejudice as a minor social awkwardness to be ushered out the door, rather than a profound moral injury being inflicted in his jurisdiction. Richard's neutrality, I realized, was another layer of the systemic apathy that allowed Stanley's racism to flourish unchecked. Richard saw an incident. I experienced an indictment. My path usually took me past the Maple Leaf Diner again. I had planned to grab a sandwich I hadn't eaten since morning, but the idea of stepping back onto that Elm Street pavement, the precise location where I had chosen honesty, felt unbearable. The pavement was now consecrated ground for my internal crisis, a monument to a good deed that had backfired violently. I kept walking, diverting my route through residential streets where the manicured lawns seemed to mock my frayed nerves. I felt an acute sense of being stripped bare. Integrity, I had always believed, was an intrinsic value. You possessed it regardless of whether it was observed or rewarded. But this experience had violently externalized it. Stanley had demanded that I perform my integrity for him, and when he saw my appearance, he immediately suspected the performance was fake. The exhausting reality of my life unfolded before me. Every mundane interaction becomes a test. Every moment is spent mitigating the expectations of prejudice. I am perpetually reading the room, adjusting my vocabulary, measuring my movements, always conscious that my physical presence inherently codes as threat or suspicion until proven otherwise, and even then, the proof is often rejected. I remembered a conversation I'd had with my grandfather years ago, talking about the burden of excellence. He told me that for men who look like us, success isn't just about achieving goals. It's about building a defensive fortress of achievement so high that people have to crane their necks to see the color of your skin beneath it. But even that fortress, I now knew, could be breached by a simple, reflexive glance from a panicked man clutching his wallet. Stanley hadn't cared about my job, my education, or my character. He only cared that I fit the profile of the person who might have stolen from him. 2 days later, the encounter continued to leach the quiet satisfaction from my life. I couldn't shake the visceral memory of Stanley's narrowed eyes. The incident had polluted the wellspring of my motivations. Why be honest if honesty is interpreted as deception? Why choose the high road if the people you help still assume you've taken a detour through crime? I was home, trying to focus on work, when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the exchange was local. I answered hesitantly. "Hello, is this Marcus Avery?" "It is." "Marcus, this is Richard Jensen from the Creekwood County substation. I apologize for calling you at home, but I wanted to follow up." I recognized Richard's measured procedural voice instantly. A small cold knot tightened in my chest. "Follow up on what? My good deed? Or Stanley's terrible behavior?" "Sure, Richard, what's up?" "Well, after Mr. Douglas left the other day, I was reviewing the police property log and thinking about how awkward that whole situation became. He was obviously very stressed, and he didn't handle himself well." Richard was attempting an apology, but it was wrapped in qualifiers: stressed, awkward, didn't handle himself well. He was still treating Stanley's racism as a social faux pas, not an act of moral violence. I leaned back in my chair, suddenly weary of providing the emotional labor for Richard's conscience. "He accused me of theft, Richard, despite the wallet being physically in your possession and accounted for." The silence on the other end was significant. It wasn't the silence of comprehension, but the silence of discomfort. "I understand that, Marcus, and I am genuinely sorry you felt that way. I wanted to call and clarify. We appreciate you bringing the item in. Your honesty was exemplary. I even noted it in the log." "Did you note his accusation in the log?" I asked, my voice flat. No, that's not really. Police procedure. He was emotional. We secured the property. End of shift." "Right," I repeated, the single word dripping with disappointment. "So my exemplary honesty is noted, but the reflexive accusation rooted entirely in racial bias is simply awkwardness and emotional stress, not worth recording." That about sums it up, Richard. My good deed is documented. The reason it felt like a punishment isn't. Richard cleared his throat. "Look, I can't speak to what was going through Mr. Douglas's mind. But I know what happened. You did the right thing. That's what matters legally." "It matters to me too, Richard. But what I learned is that, legally, I am the man who returned the wallet. Socially, culturally, I am still the man who had to prove he didn't steal it. That social verdict is the one that follows me." I felt a sudden, profound desire to end the conversation. Richard was well-meaning enough, but he was calling from a position of comfortable distance. He didn't have to carry the weight of that experience into every room he entered. "Thank you for the call, Richard," I said, cutting him off gently, but firmly. "I appreciate the thought, but the lesson of that day wasn't about the wallet. It was about context, and unfortunately, that's not something you can log or file away." I hung up, the clean click of the phone amplifying the finality of the realization. Richard's desire for procedural closure could not mend the psychological rupture Stanley had caused. The institution, even when technically validating, remained fundamentally blind to the underlying injury. The next few days were an exercise in self-reassessment, a dangerous internal interrogation that brought me to the emotional climax of this entire ordeal. The integrity I valued so highly suddenly felt like a heavy, useless coat in the summer heat. What was the point of holding myself to a higher standard if the world insisted on judging me by the lowest one? This feeling came to a head on a particularly hot afternoon, 3 days after the police station incident. I was walking through the main shopping district, running an errand near the local banker place, where I instinctively walked slightly straighter and kept my hands highly visible. I saw it almost immediately, glinting in the harsh sunlight near the automated teller machines. It wasn't a wallet this time, but a small, heavy wad of cash, secured with a rubber band. It had clearly slipped from someone's pocket or hand while they were using the machine. It was a significant amount, certainly more than the substantial amount in Stanley's wallet. I froze. My immediate, ingrained response, the response honed over years of moral training, was to pick it up and march it straight to the bank security, or, failing that, back to the Creekwood County substation. That was the Marcus Avery of a week ago. But the Marcus Avery of today, the one scarred by Stanley's gaze, hesitated. Why? The question echoed internally, savage and relentless. Why do it again? The money sat there, inert, offering a potent, dangerous opportunity. No one was around. The street was briefly empty. This was a clean slate, an anonymous transaction that would redress the balance, compensate me for the psychological tax Stanley had levied. It would be a silent, secret protest against a world that demands impeccable character but refuses to acknowledge it when it appears. The temptation was a physical ache, centered not in greed, but in wounded pride. It was the desire for defiant self-preservation. If my reputation is already decided, if my appearance already speaks louder than my actions, then why continue to play a game rigged against me? Why shouldn't I embody the caricature they already painted? To take the money would be to finally align my internal self with the external judgment, to stop fighting the lie. I took one slow, deliberate step toward the money. I could feel the blood pounding in my temples. This wasn't about the cash. It was a battle for the soul of Marcus. If I took it, I would prove Stanley right. I would concede that his prejudice had the power to fundamentally alter my character. My hand started to tremble slightly as I reached down, hovering inches above the crumpled bills. The sun felt searing hot on the back of my neck, and the air around me seemed charged with expectation. The internal voices were at war. Take it. They already assume you would. You owe them nothing. They owe you this. Versus no. You know who you are. Don't let their hatred define your goodness. The weight of Stanley's question crashed down on me one last time. Were you tempted to take anything first? In that moment, standing over the illicit money, the answer was a searing, humiliating yes. I was tempted, not by need, but by bitterness. The color of my skin had spoken, and I was dangerously close to letting that voice write my script. But then another thought, sharp and clear, pierced the noise. If I took the money, Stanley Douglas would have stolen more than just $20 worth of self-respect. He would have stolen my fundamental belief in myself, the core integrity that is the only thing truly mine. He would have won. With a gasp that sounded choked, I pulled my hand back. The effort felt monumental, like lifting an impossible weight. It was the hardest moral decision I had ever faced. Precisely because the moral incentive, the world's validation, had been utterly destroyed days earlier. I chose integrity not for the world, but for the man I was terrified of becoming. I stood up straight, my heart still racing. My initial impulse, the one born of pure exhaustion and anger, was defeated. But the experience was permanently altered. I performed the right action, but the action was no longer effortless. It was scarred by the intense internal fight, marked by the proximity to compromise. The act of decency was no longer a shield. It was a scar. Walking away from the bank, back toward the main street, I knew the true conclusion of the wallet incident. The episode with Stanley had not been a one-off confrontation. It had been a corrosive agent that altered the very structure of my ethical landscape. I had gone from simply being an honest man to being a man who must perpetually re-choose honesty in the face of deep, institutionalized invalidation. The burden was unbearable. The knowledge that every time I act honorably, I am not simply doing good. I am actively fighting a narrative that insists I should be doing bad. Later that evening, sitting alone, I finally allowed myself to process the full, chilling implication of the events at the police substation. It wasn't just Stanley's individual prejudice that was the problem. It was the way the entire environment, the heat, Richard's procedural indifference, the history of the country conspired to make his prejudice feel logical, even predictable. Stanley saw me and instantly solved a simple equation. Dark skin plus lost property equals potential crime. The retrieved wallet was merely a faulty data point in his otherwise perfect calculation. I realized that the goal of my life could no longer be to prove my decency to external forces. That battle was unwinnable. My dignity, my true value, had to be internalized, fiercely guarded within the citadel of my own conscience, independent of whether Stanley Douglas or anyone else could ever perceive it. I understood then the quiet, persistent exhaustion that permeates the lives of men like me. It is the burden of constant self-management, the weight of living under a microscope that magnifies your flaws and diminishes your achievements. The heavily filled leather wallet was long forgotten by its owner, filed away as a minor inconvenience solved. But for me, it remained an open wound. It was the physical proof that my choices, my commitment to integrity, my refusal to succumb to temptation are always secondary to a visual, predetermined classification. I walked away from that experience with the ultimate truth, a bitter mantra humming in my memory. While I may strive for good, my identity will always precede my virtue. The racism doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just whispers, echoing in the empty space where gratitude should have been. You will never be enough to erase the suspicion. And as the sun finally set over Crickwood County, casting long, dark shadows across Elm Street pavement, I knew I would keep choosing to do the good. Not because I expected the world to finally see me, but because the alternative was allowing their hatred to consume my light. It was an exhausting, solitary victory, paid for by the loss of simple, unburdened decency. The price of that $20, refused but still felt, was the permanent recognition that I live in a world where my efforts are often invisible and only the color of my skin has volume. The chapter was closed, but the lesson, the cold, hard truth was embedded forever. I had done the good, but my color had shouted. The profound exhaustion that followed was not merely physical fatigue. It was the deep spiritual tiredness that settles when you realize the war is unwinnable, but the fight must continue. I had spent my life building a moral framework so sturdy it was supposed to withstand any external pressure. Stanley, with his terrified, judgmental gaze, hadn't just chipped away at that framework. He had demonstrated that to people like him, the structure was inherently invisible. All he saw was the exterior, and that exterior was permanently coded as suspect. I sat on my couch, the sunlight cutting sharp lines across the hardwood floor, tracing the geography of my living room. I tried to focus on the simple reality of my immediate surroundings, to ground myself after the metaphysical battle waged over 40 crumpled bills. The realization struck me. The act of choosing integrity had become laborious. It was no longer a default setting. It was a conscious, painful override of a justifiable bitterness. I remembered the brief conversation with Richard, the officer. He had sought procedural peace, a clean file. His call was less about apologizing for the institutional failure and more about tidying up a loose thread of discomfort. His inability to log Stanley's accusation as anything other than awkwardness was not personal malice. It was the institutional indifference I had come to expect. The system only tracks verifiable facts: the wallet, the time, the signature. It has no column for invisible moral injury. Richard was operating within the comfortable boundaries of procedure. He saw a citizen returning property and another citizen being impolite due to stress. He couldn't, or wouldn't, see the moral gravity of Stanley's assumption, the immediate, total dismissal of Marcus's humanity based on appearance. That blindness was, in its own quiet way, more damaging than Stanley's open contempt. Stanley was an individual antagonist. Richard represented the neutral void that allows antagonists to thrive. The image of the Creekwood County Police substation flashed in my mind. Brightly lit, functional, municipal. It was designed to look transparent and welcoming, a local point of community presence. But beneath that veneer of civic order, it was a space where the rules of evidence and conduct were selectively applied. The physical space, intended to be a sanctuary of law, became the perfect stage for the performance of prejudice, where the victim's integrity had to be actively vouched for. While the accuser's bias was waved away as stress, I started tracking the subtle shifts in my own behavior since the incident. Before Stanley, I was careful. After Stanley, I was hypervigilant. Walking into a store, my hands stayed deliberately out of my pockets, even if I was just looking at items on a bottom shelf. Driving, I ensured my hands were always visible on the steering wheel, even when waiting at a red light. These were not conscious, dramatic decisions. They were minute, automatic adjustments, the constant, low-grade tax of existing in a body perceived as threatening. It was the labor of managing other people's fear. I had been forced into an exhausting, perpetual audition for basic trustworthiness. Every time I held open a door, made eye contact, or spoke clearly, I was fighting the pre-written script Stanley had confirmed that I was always on the verge of criminality. This constant self-policing consumed cognitive energy that should have been spent on my actual life, my work, my creativity. Instead, it was spent neutralizing the imaginary threat I represented to people like Stanley. I thought back to the Elm Street pavement, the precise location where I had first spotted the heavily filled leather wallet. It was a sun-drenched patch of concrete, anonymous and unremarkable. Yet in my memory, it had become the dividing line in my life. Before, it was just a sidewalk. Now, it was the site of the original sin, the moment I chose honesty and received suspicion in return. The Maple Leaf Diner, sitting just across the street, symbolized the quaint, idealized small-town life. It promised comfort and community. But the reality I encountered just steps away from its cozy sign was the hard, cold truth that small-town friendliness often comes with deeply entrenched, unspoken rules about who belongs and who is merely passing through. I hadn't gone back for that sandwich, and now I wasn't sure if I ever would. The simple act of eating there would feel like a concession, a return to a place that had silently witnessed the assassination of my simple decency. My grandfather's words returned to me, heavier now, burdened with new meaning. He hadn't just spoken of the burden of excellence. He had described a life of perpetual defense. Marcus, he'd said, his voice gravelly with decades of lived experience, you have to work twice as hard just to be considered half as good. And even then, they don't see the work. They only see the color. I had always interpreted that advice as a mandate for professional achievement. Get the degree. Get the good job. Be beyond reproach. But the wallet incident revealed the flaw in that logic. Stanley hadn't performed a background check. He had performed a glance. All my accrued successes, the fortress of achievement I had painstakingly built, meant nothing in the face of his immediate, visceral panic. The skin color was the initial headline, and no amount of positive subtext could override it. The psychological residue left by the encounter was corrosive. It wasn't the $20 Stanley offered and I refused that mattered. It was the implicit price of the interaction. I realized that Stanley felt he was offering me a reward for deviating from the assumed criminal script. He wasn't paying me for my honesty. He was trying to buy his way out of his own shame, or perhaps paying me off for the inconvenience of being black in his moment of stress. My refusal to take the money was my final desperate attempt to assert my intrinsic value, a value he fundamentally denied. Now, weeks later, the physical objects related to the event, the wallet, the police property log, were mere administrative footnotes. But for me, they were anchors to an evolving trauma. The log noted my exemplary honesty. But where was the log entry for the profound moral fatigue? Where was the record of the thousands of silent micro-calculations I now made daily? The incident had forced me into a painful re-evaluation of my motivations. Why had I done it? Why didn't I just leave the wallet? The simple answer, because it was the right thing to do, felt childish now, naive. The adult-scarred answer was complex. I did it because I was Marcus Avery and I believed integrity defined me. I did it because the alternative was conceding to the lower expectations of others. I did it because I needed to be able to look myself in the mirror, regardless of who else was looking. The fight I waged at the bank was not against greed. It was against the seduction of bitterness. Bitterness whispered a powerful, coherent argument. If the world insists on treating you like a criminal, why exhaust yourself trying to be a saint? Align yourself with their perception, and at least you gain something material. The resistance required was monumental, a physical tearing away from that dark rationale. The aftermath of that ethical struggle left a gaping wound in my worldview. The world had lost its texture of simple right and wrong. Everything was now shaded by the unavoidable context of race. When I saw someone struggle, my instinct was still to help. But immediately following that instinct was a wave of anxiety. How will this act be perceived? The spontaneous joy of simple decency was gone, replaced by calculated risk assessment. I started thinking about Stanley not as a villain, but as a product, a man terrified of chaos, who uses racism as a shortcut to order. When he saw the wallet recovered, his brain sought the simplest narrative to explain the anomaly of a black man doing good. The only available narrative, steeped in cultural stereotypes, suggested an attempt at deceit, a momentary temptation overcome, or a potential crime in progress interrupted. His brain defaulted. He must have been about to steal it. This reflexive suspicion was a shield against the unsettling reality that good people exist everywhere, even in bodies he had been taught to distrust. What I had witnessed was the casual, ingrained nature of systemic racism in a small, seemingly benign setting. It wasn't the hooded Klan member shouting slurs. It was the small-town businessman asking a polite yet profound accusation in a brightly lit police station. This quiet racism, the kind that merely assumes the worst and moves on, is the most insidious because it hides behind the veil of plausibility. I realized that my mission moving forward could no longer be to correct Stanley, or Richard, or the institution they represented. My mission had to be the preservation of my internal landscape. I got up and walked into my kitchen, pouring a glass of water. The simple act of drinking felt restorative, focusing me on the immediate, tangible reality. I stared out the window at the familiar, sleepy neighborhood. Everything looked the same, the manicured lawns, the slow-moving cars, but my perception was fundamentally altered. I saw the hidden lines, the unspoken barriers, the invisible fences that determined who could move freely and who had to constantly negotiate their presence. The true weight of the experience settled upon me, the knowledge that I was required to carry an extra, invisible emotional burden every day. This burden was the need to constantly prove not just my worth, but my non-threat status. It was the perpetual task of managing the fear of others, a task entirely unasked for and uncompensated. I reflected on Richard again. His call was a gesture towards fairness, but a gesture entirely contained within his own comfort zone. He wanted the records to be clean, and for me to accept his limited validation. But his inability to engage with the actual injustice, the why of Stanley's behavior, meant that the system he represented was incapable of true resolution. The procedural justice was a thin veneer over a moral chasm. Stanley's wallet, recovered and forgotten, had taught me the definition of modern exhaustion. It is the exhaustion of fighting a ghost, a societal narrative that cannot be reasoned with, only navigated. Every successful navigation feels less like a victory and more like a necessary survival technique. The integrity I cherished was not invalidated by Stanley. It was merely rendered invisible to him and those who shared his worldview. The key was to stop demanding that they acknowledge it. Their acknowledgement was a currency I could no longer afford to chase. The final cold clarity arrived as the evening deepened, the oppressive heat of the day finally beginning to recede. The lesson wasn't about the wallet, or the cash, or even Stanley. It was about defining self-worth entirely on my own terms. I had done the good. I had returned the wallet, not for thanks, not for reward, and certainly not for the validation of Stanley or the documentation of Richard. I did it because integrity is not a performance. It is a fundamental state of being. But the persistent, exhausting counter-narrative remained. I could perform the highest act of civic duty, but the simple fact of my skin color would immediately introduce doubt. My actions were always debated. My identity was always assumed. I recognized that the silent exhaustion I felt was the chronic condition of living under that whisper. You will never be enough to erase the suspicion. This whisper doesn't need to be loud to be effective. It merely needs to be constant, eroding confidence and trust over time. I made a silent pact with myself. I would not allow their prejudice to govern my decency. I would continue to choose the high road, not as a desperate plea for acceptance, but as an act of internal rebellion. My goodness would become a defiant, private truth, something they could not steal, categorize, or deny, because it would exist purely for me. This acceptance was heavy. It meant accepting that the world would rarely, if ever, see the full picture of Marcus Avery. It meant letting go of the expectation of simple gratitude or recognition. It meant living in the knowledge that my inherent worth would always require translation for the Stanleys of the world, and that translation would almost always fail. The heavily filled leather wallet was closed. The official record was clean. The incident was over. But the knowledge it baked, the profound, visceral understanding of the distance between my actions and their perception, would define every choice I made from that day forward. I did the good. I returned what was lost. I refused temptation. And yet, the judgment still spoke louder than the deed. It was the price of clarity, the cost of seeing the world as it truly was, stripped of the comforting illusion of meritocracy. It was a solitary, heavy truth. I was Marcus Avery, a man who chose light in a world determined to cast him in shadow, and that choice would forever be a silent struggle. I had done the good, but my color had shouted, and the echo was permanent. The only comfort was the quiet, non-negotiable certainty of my own heart. The story of the wallet was finished, but the quiet, ongoing act of reclaiming my identity had just begun. Drop a like and subscribe. That's how we grow.